This is Signal and Noise, bringing clarity to data, tech, and AI.
Welcome, everybody, to another exciting episode of Signal and Noise. We are a no BS media franchise bringing clarity to data, tech, and AI. And as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Rhea Longacre. I'm Brett House. We've got some very exciting guests today, David Nyurenberg and Sarah Caputo. Did I say that right, Sarah?
You did. Yeah.
I did. Great.
Okay.
The topic, before I introduce David and Sarah, which is the first time we've had two guests at once, which should be pretty interesting, is the cost of keeping quiet, media responsibility, and the incentives that enforce silence. Now, that's a juicy topic. So, as you can imagine, this episode should uncover a lot about ad fraud and related topics. But the difference between this and other episodes is that David and Sarah have written a really compelling article, which should be available when this episode launches, about their firsthand experience sort of in the dark underbelly of ad tech and martech, right? Seeing how incentives impact and affect people's decisions when it comes to media quality, ad fraud, and what you're representing to brands and how brands are thinking about a lot of these topics. So before we go any deeper into the theme, which Rio will introduce in a second, I want to give Sarah and David an opportunity to introduce themselves for those that don't know them, rather than me doing the introductions. David, why don't you start, and then Sarah follow up?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, Brett, kudos to getting my name right. That's usually a challenge for many. So I'm David Nyurenberg. I am a performance marketer for about 15 years now. Started out on the publisher side, then bounced around to a few ad tech companies, then was on the holding company side, then had my own consultancy for 4 years. And then after that, I've been deep in the CTV space for the past 5 years, working and leading up CTV innovation strategy at multiple agencies. Currently, I'm the SVP of digital at Intermedia Advertising. We're a 50-year-old linear TV agency out of LA, where I am tasked with building up our digital and CTV capabilities and bringing over many of these legacy linear DR advertisers into the performance CTV space. So I've been naturally challenged with figuring out all the challenges in the CTV space around transparency and driving performance and measurement. So that's where I've been having lots of fun in the past 5 years.
Sarah.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Hard to follow David. He's very good and well known, apparently, as well. I have been in the industry 21 years. I always joke that my career is old enough to drink legally now. And I have been in basically every role, but I did start at agencies, and I actually started at on the brand side. I did a lot of brand positioning work, creative and development for large CPG companies, hospitality. I moved into Allstate on the brand side as my inroad into enterprise. I was there 8 years and moved around building capabilities from one department to another, ending up in housing Allstate's media buying program from a managed service model, oversaw programmatic social and the tech stack. So quite a bit happened there. And now I'm on my own as a consultant and advisor. I've been teaching a lot of workshops with Amazon, Nielsen, Viant, Roku, Cars, Walmart's coming up for their ad platform on attribution and housing, you name it, DSP competitives there. But I also flip on the brand hat and work enterprise side to try to help them with ultimately their data and tech stack to ensure that they're going to be able to go to market adjacent to the goals that they have.
Yeah. Well, and kudos to Sarah for saying 21 years, because most of us stop at 20. We talked about it in our last episode.
30 is kind of scary, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm like, I don't think I'm ever going to say 30, so I'm going to say 20 until I retire at 70, 80 years old. I'll be like 20 years in the ad tech and martech world. But anyways, I like your story about 21 and the drinking age. That's a pretty good,
once it's old enough to
line.
drink, I will not say how many years it's been.
So
nice,
Rhea.
love it. Awesome. Well, that was a great intro for the two of you. And this episode, The Cost of Being Quiet, I guess the genesis of this, Brett, was we all went to dinner. It was a bigger group, and Sarah did sit at the side of the table, at the opposite side of the table. So we didn't get to engage with her as much as we probably would have liked to, but we all started talking about this concept. And then David and Sarah wrote this amazing article, which I encourage everyone to read, Cost of Keeping Quiet. And that's really where this episode came out of. And this, what I really liked about it is this, for anyone who's worked in the media space knows that this kind of taps into something that everyone knows, but no one really says out loud. Namely, the system is broken because silence is not only encouraged, but it's kind of rewarded, right? Like we spend massive dollars as an industry, and a lot of that value just gets leaked out through waste, low quality inventory, MFA, bad incentives. We all know the saying, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes. Well, there's a lot of really like poorly aligned incentives, let's just say, in the industry. And the core issue is that, like, it's not that fraud exists. We all know it is. I mean, we know it's not 1%. We know it's a lot higher than that, right? We know that, it could be 25, could be 30, could be more than that, right? Depending who you ask. If you ask the foo, he'll tell you it's 80 or 90%, right? But there's a lot of fraud out there. We know it exists. And somehow the market structure tolerates it, mostly because so many people benefit from the spend continuing to flow, right? The more that's spent, everyone is taking the way ad tech typically prices a take rate, right? There's a DSPs take a percentage, SSPs take a percentage, all these other vendors take a percentage. And so there are incentives to keep the spend high. And there's a disincentive to really call out the fraud that we really all know is there. The buy side, you would think, is the last line of defense for the marketer, protecting their budget, right? And it's only if buyers demand transparency, insist on control, when they observe dark patterns and bad behavior, calling that out, you think they would be doing that. But because of these incentives, it's very, very difficult to solve. As the foo himself put it, ad fraud is an incentives problem. In this episode, we help to discuss that and see how we can maybe talk about breaking that loop. So with that said, we know ad fraud is an incentives problem. We know it's not 1%. We know it's more than that. Brett, first question's over to you.
All right. So, so I'll start with, you guys have some very interesting stories to tell from your own experiences, and that's really what the article is about. And the article, by the way, for the audience is on signalandnoise.ai, which at the point of this episode being published should be live. It's not live yet, but it should be live when this episode goes. But so why do you think, and I'll start with you, David, and then we'll go to Sarah. Why do you think the system keeps rewarding silence? I mean, we talked a lot about incentives and misaligned incentives, but tell us from your firsthand account what you've experienced and what you really think the driving behavior is.
Yeah, well, I think there's multiple factors here. One of which being just the financial models on top of which this industry runs, right? In many cases, most vendors, agencies are taking some type of margin, right? Sometimes it's transparent, flat margin. Many media vendors are operating on non-transparent margins, right? So they're depending on the arbitrage model, right? And, in a world where there are multiple mouths to feed, right? Digital introduced this ecosystem of tech players that are all trying to extract value out of the media dollar, where in the past, you would have the agency and you would have the publisher, right? And the agency would pay the publisher, and there was a very direct, non-complicated line of payment. Now you have a DSP, you have an SSP, you have the publisher, you have the ad server, you have the measurement partner. Everyone is trying to extract some value out of the CPM, while at the end of the day, the publisher still needs to get paid and still needs to make enough money to sustain themselves, right? So, and then at the end of the day, also the media buyer and the agency also needs to be able to pay their staff and get some money out at the same time, right? So, with all these different mouths to feed, you're going to need scale, right? You're going to depend on moving as much money as possible, to what Rio said. So you're not going to want to kind of do anything possible to hurt scale and raise questions about where money's going and to whom, right? You're going to want to just keep everything just flowing nice and happily between all sides.
Yeah, and when you say you in this topic, are you talking both the brand, the buy side, the brand, and their agency representative, or is that more of an agency problem where it's like use it or lose it type of issue, right? Where they're getting budget, they're required to spend that budget, and then
And they
can
get
put
paid
some,
out of a cut of that budget, right?
yeah, and they can
Right. Well,
throw out some vanity metrics, right? Some reach metrics, and ROAS metrics that don't necessarily prove definitively outcomes, and yet continue to defend their budgets, right? I
yeah,
mean, what do you think?
I think it's very convenient. We love pointing fingers at all the tech companies in the space, and agencies, but in many ways, brands are kind of responsible for this world that we live in these days, right? They keep pushing their agencies and partners down on margin to the point where it's not sustainable. They view media as all commoditized, right? So they just want the lowest possible CPMs, right? And naturally, when you go after the lowest possible CPMs, you're gonna have to sacrifice something there, and often that is media quality. But at the same time, brands don't want to know that they're buying poor quality media or MFA or anything like that. So yes, the tech companies, some agencies, some vendors, they might not be operating above board and trying to keep things under the water, so to speak. But at the same time, they're kind of having to deal with the hands that the brands are dealing them, which is lower CPMs, lower margins, and naturally, people need to get paid and companies need to keep growing revenue, right? So something has to give there.
It's funny you mentioned that. I once had a client, we were pitching them, and then they told us halfway through the pitch, "Oh, we've decided to outsource it to India." It's like this is buying media. This isn't like I don't know. This isn't like business process outsourcing, right? This is like So I just thought it was crazy, right? And they said, "Oh, they'll do for half the price." So, um, crazy stuff. So, Sarah, I mean, love to get your take. I mean, I loved in the article you talked about your experience at one of the big holdcos, about you receiving some backlash for actually questioning some of these things. Maybe you can start to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think you guys have covered quite a bit of ground, and I'll go further upstream, since David has already hit on quite a few points. Um, they don't. I think we have made a problem with programmatic that it's more science than art. I think it's problematic for a few reasons. One, the creative is just getting lost in translation, and we're over-indexing on precision and science, which is just not the reality, nor is it logical from a marketing perspective. But the second part of that is you are putting pricing pressure way upstream, especially in the larger companies with procurement involved. We're looking at it as a cost um, situation, like you said, front end CPMs versus an outcomes situation. And they don't understand the complexity of what's being bought. So, Rio, to your point around, outsourcing to India, I'm not saying there's anything bad with certain skills and capabilities, but usually you want to sit close to those partners and relationships because when you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars and your business is relying on those outcomes, sitting closer to those teams and proximity and security, I think is really, really important. So I think we're looking at the wrong things from a brand perspective. And then the second thing I'll say is structurally, brands are not built for this sort of complexity. And what I mean by that is if you're really doing the right thing on the brand side, you're focused on product, customer experience, and user value, and also driving those revenue outcomes. So when you get stuck into the nuances of having to triple check and go under every single nook and cranny that the industry has made so incredibly complex without a doctorate degree, it has created a problem and pressure on the brand side where it's difficult also to keep up. So it's just kind of full circle, to be honest, on all sides. And brands aren't usually reputationally allowed to talk about their partners or where they may have gone sideways. So it becomes a reputational problem to boot.
So it's interesting. So, David, on one hand, you're saying like it does go up. It should be the brand's ultimate. They should be accountable for this, let's say, right? But Sarah, you're saying that it's super complex. Maybe it's unfair to expect the brand to know it. And we had Fu on this pod a few months ago, and he even said he doesn't even think programmatic should be handled by agencies. He says he thinks it should be handled by brands, which is an interesting argument because he said really it's an auction, right? Why would you need someone doing it for you? So I thought those are all interesting. So what do you think though? Like who's really does the buck stop at the brand? Should it? Should we expect them to be better informed about should they know, for example, that more than 50 cents out of the dollar in open exchange is not going to the publisher. It's being scraped off by all these intermediaries. Like, love your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think procurement, who is not technically savvy and doesn't really understand what's happening in the industry, uh, really has an outsized role in all this. Where I can't tell you how many pitches I've had where come in with a great media strategy, great research, great pitch, brand loves it, and then at the end of the day, it still comes down to just procurement asking for your CPMS, and they're just comparing your CPMS to the other agencies, and that's where the final decision, or a big part of the decision, ultimately comes from. So to Sarah's point, we've made this more of
It's
a
a race to the
science.
bottom, right?
It is,
Right.
yeah.
So Sarah said it's more of a science. We've kind of made this more of a science and less of an art, where advertising historically has been both part science and part art, right? And the art has part of it has been like the psychological aspect of advertising. How do you influence people? What are the best channels to influence your target audience? What unique out of the box ideas do you have to stand out from the crowd? That art all gets lost at the end of the day when what the brand really wants to know is how much are you getting this publisher for versus the competitor agency? How much are you getting that same publisher for? What are your rates on the DSP? Right? All these pricing factors completely disregard ultimately what really makes advertising special and what many people who work at advertising got into this industry for.
Has it
Yeah,
always been that way, or has it intensified in recent years? Like the procurement driven, let's say, like as Brett, you said, the race to the bottom in terms of just trying to find the lowest CPMs.
From what I understand, once McKinsey and Deloitte and all those consultancies
Damn
started getting
consultants.
into the advertising space and working with the brands and really influencing procurement, I think that was in the early 2010s, around or about around that time. That's when things really started being more price focused in
Yeah,
that space.
Yeah,
consultants
well,
did invent procurement. Just
Yeah.
I confirm that. I
yeah.
didn't, but the consulting did. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sarah?
well, and it's an interesting point about you guys are saying science, but I think there's something profoundly unscientific about like media ineffectiveness and the fact that brands may not have a full grasp, or even the agencies, of how much of their actual media investment is actually being seen by end users, and how much
Yeah.
is actually going down the either it's an impression that's being triggered but not shown, like in the case of CTV, or it's an ad fraud play where it's going to an MFA based site. To me, if you're scientific about this and you're really focusing on outcomes, right? Shouldn't you be able to connect the dots and understand the inefficiency built into your total impression served, your total dollars spent, and go to cut that out? And wouldn't that be the more scientific approach if it's really about driving performance? And is that even possible when you're in a world where where you're being forced down the sort of the cheaper approach to buying media?
Well, I'd say try explaining that to the procurement teams. I love procurement, by the way. I worked really well with them at Allstate, and I'm not just saying that. They definitely understood where there was expertise to lean on
Some
for
of
a
your
minute.
best friends work in procurement, right?
Yeah, I loved Marie. Honestly, Marie Colby, I'm going to shout her out. There's a couple others. They were really amazing at allowing the expertise to
I'm
come
just
through.
giving you a hard time.
I have to. She's retired anyway. But I think it's more about the science is more about what people feel can be definitively quantified, and comparing the apples to apples, and that is the common denominator that they come up with, versus the art part, versus that science quantifiable part is actually about logic and intuition. And somewhere along the way, we have forgotten that we all have instincts, and you don't need to quantify everything to the nth degree and at 100% definitive and deterministic in our language in order to
Yep.
make a logical business decision. We were able to do this before the internet really, really well, and we lost sight of that because everything needs to be put on a deck, on a stakeholder report, or on a QBR, where everything is, to the dollar. And so this is where I always guide brands to take a step back and do really thorough outside platform and inside platform testing to kind of show what trends are over time versus relying on every single penny, because impossible. One, two, it's quite inefficient to do so. So I think it's pivoting to more of the testing methodologies as the gold standard in order to come to those conclusions, and making sure you have that testing in place before you sign your life away, to one partner or a set of partners. Could go in a crawl, walk, run, and test into these things in a way that's smart and logical.
And when you test into these things, you mean you could test, for example, a top of funnel brand awareness play that might have a halo effect over your more direct response, lower funnel advertising approaches, right? Would you say test those things to see the with the control, right? Exposed versus unexposed, to see how those perform so people can be more convinced. I mean, I saw this a lot in the financial services industry, where financial services 70 to 80%, this was JP Morgan, Bank of America, et cetera, spent 70 to 80% of their total budget was spent on direct mail marketing for the most part. Direct mail and direct response digital extensions.
Yeah.
And there tended to be, and I've talked about this before in the pod, they tended to look negatively at the brand spin that was being spent on bigger, broader reach channels, CTV, television, etc., because they couldn't attribute the halo effect as cleanly as they would have liked, versus what they were doing in direct mail marketing and in direct response marketing, which was much closer to sort of an action or
one-to-one.
conversion event, right?
Physical address based on your customer file, if you have accuracy there. And offline wise, I get it. But you're right. It's the equivalent to me of last touch attribution.
Yep.
Just because someone had an impression in a piece of mail, you have to look at everything as an impression. I look at a billboard the same way. Everything is an impression to the consumer's eyes. It's just eyeballs that you want and attention over time. So it's exactly right. The physical address combination is a one-to-one match. So you kind of tend to default toward things, even though if you took a step back, your logic and intuition would probably say, hey, maybe we're over-indexing.
Yeah. And if you scientifically look at it,
Yeah.
like we would do these pretty advanced models that were sort of a combination. They were MTA, but they were a combination of MTA and MMN. Kind of and what they proved was that the halo effect actually had a direct impact on the lower funnel performance, right? And when you compared apples to apples between a sort of an 80-20 split between lower and upper and like a 50-50 split, the 50-50 split won every time, and we would simulate these programs and we had like 10 years of historical data. So it wasn't like we're operating with a small data set. But it's hard to prove because it's not tangible. You can't really show it in a spreadsheet, and people tend to trust what they see as that last click or that final action committed by the consumer, right?
Exactly.
We talk about a lot of this being the age of outcomes, right?
Long-term.
Sorry, David, I cut you off. We talk about this being the age of outcomes, right? And, outcomes, Brett, you just mentioned all the different ways we measure things, the last click being one, and I think you can make the argument these are just vanity metrics and they're widely abused. So David, maybe start with you. Love to hear, how can better metrics, better understanding of what they mean, how could that maybe drive like better targeting of media, better planning, and maybe help those brands be better informed in what they should be looking at in terms of how they evaluate success?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one, it starts with understanding that not every impression is created equal. We've really commoditized media to the point where, a reach number on display for many people will almost be similar to a reach number on CTV, right? And because display is so much cheaper, they'll be like, all right, let's put more money into the display than it should probably get. But ultimately, you really need to have an understanding of the dynamics of every single channel and the various pitfalls involved and how things are gamed. Because the thing about digital is you could spin up an almost unlimited amount of impressions, and there's a giant ecosystem of bad actors who are constantly evolving, because it's just and finding ways to extract more and more value out of the ecosystem, because it's just so easy to do, right? So like understanding those pitfalls, valuing channels accordingly, and also knowing that ultimately what you get what you pay for, right? So if you're going to pay for cheap impressions, those impressions themselves, maybe there's some value there, but it's not going to be the type of value that you might think. That reach number probably isn't as real as you want it to be, right? When you're looking at it. So, and you also need patience, right? And you need to set expectations with clients too. Advertising has always been a long game, right? how many people watch an ad on their TV and automatically convert when they see that ad? No matter how much we want to push this performance CTV narrative, I think it's ultimately hurting us as an industry because it's creating these false expectations with clients that, yeah, if you put a QR code in creative, people are going to scan the creative and they're going to convert. Right now, those units often come at pretty expensive premiums. Right, so the brand is going to pay that expensive premium, thinking they're going to drive lots of outcomes. Then they're going to get their reporting back and see that not many people actually scan that QR code, and then they're going to be turned off from CTV for the immediate future. So I think for us, right, you do need to measure things in multiple ways, right? The last touch, the direct response actions, many times, especially in CTV, are more directional because there's so many different measurement gaps and signal loss happening in the industry.
Hmm.
So so there's that, and then there's the long term approaches via MMMs, and match market tests and all those type of more extensive testing, right? It's easy for us to look at the last touch model and just depend on that, because it's fast, immediate. Oftentimes it gives us the metrics that we want to see. But if you put all your eggs in that basket, long term, you're going to see diminishing returns, and you're going to go into what many DTC brands have experienced over the past several years after the DTC hype cycle died out, which is what I call the death loop, where they're just constantly chasing those direct response metrics. Might look good, but they're not building long term brand awareness, and they're ultimately probably converting against people that were going to convert regardless, and wasting
Yep.
lots of budget.
A lot of those DCC brands are now gone, which is interesting, or they've scaled back significantly. You mentioned CTV, and I saw you posting about this a lot, and I really like this, and love to maybe get your thought on it before we hear from Sarah on the vanity metrics thing. So you had meant like legit CTV in stream, high quality inventory, right? Versus let's call it bogus CTV where it's outstream. Let's say a lot of times below the fold even, right? That, they might be lower CPMs. So I think a lot of clients are confused about that. Is that safe to say about like what is CTV?
Well, uh, the thing is that I think we've kind of overstated how much available CTV inventory there is, right? We love talking about how many people are watching CTV, right? But I rarely see people go into how many people are actually watching ad-supported CTV compared to the entire CTV universe, which also includes non-ad subscriptions.
Yeah, which would be the fast channels, right?
Right. So, like, to me, like, we still haven't really we like to think that fasts are lower quality publishers, right? But we also haven't really defined what quality in the CTV space is, right? So for me, it's like ad load, right? We really need to start tracking ad load against publishers, right? Because if there's 5 ads every 2 minutes in a CTV stream, that's going to piss people off, and they're also not going to necessarily be put as much attention into the ads as they might otherwise if there was only like 1 or 2 ads every so often, right? So that's like a proxy metric for me that we need to start looking at for CTV that currently we're not doing. Additionally, there's a lot of actors in the space because CTV is so expensive, because there's not that much as much inventory as we'd like to think. They're mixing in online video, and to your point, those
Yep.
outstream units, which is like the bulk of what's out there in the online video space. And
And
the
is that
thing,
being labeled as CTV within the buying platforms in some cases where it's off the television glass?
Sorry,
so
you're
like
laughing.
so the
I'm
thing is
laughing
like
because I think David has an opinion based on a what read. I'm like anticipating how he's going to phrase this.
Yeah, because do you tie CTV to the device, which would be the television glass, which is your sort of sight-sounded motion experience that's different than any other digital device,
device
that we
ID, yeah.
use, right? Or do you tie CTV to the type of content, right? So you could argue that CTV content, YouTube might be an exception to this, but is generally longer form. It's generally more narrative driven, whereas the stuff that's off of the television glass tends to be shorter form, less narrative driven, like the TikTok feeds and such. But how do you like? Is it a content thing? Is it a device thing? You're talking about the ads being served,
right.
but what is CTV?
Well, there's OTT, which is streaming content over an internet connection, right?
Yeah.
And then there's CTV, for me at least, where you're actually watching that OTT content on a TV screen.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of buyers will be buying what they think is CTV, but ultimately they're getting they're also buying Hulu, which is being watched on people's iPads or
Yep.
on their phones or on their computer devices, which to me, that's okay. But like the fact that CTV, like the OTT streaming space is highly non-transparent, there's not a lot of signals being shared in the metadata at the same time, right? You're not really seeing what you're delivering against. It's all blind in many ways as like one bundled package. Um, that leaves a lot of space for bad actors to slide in addition to legitimate CTV, right? They're also sliding in on desktop and mobile devices, media running on their owned and operated sites, for instance, right? And because it's all bundled under one business name, right? You really can't tell, okay, is this desktop, mobile, tablet impression actually in the streaming app, or is it an outstream impression on this publisher's owned and operated website, right? And there's a good amount of that happening, which I think is diluting the quality of CTV these days and further not helping things. On the flip side of that, those desktop mobile impressions are also a bit more trackable, right? They're oftentimes they're in a cookie-based environment. So that helps on the direct response side of things too. So one of the reasons vendors, publishers might be mixing in those those types of online video units is because it helps them. Not only does it help on the CPM side of things because they're naturally cheaper, but it also helps on the direct response performance side of things because it's in a more measurable signal-rich environment where oftentimes if it's an outstream unit, someone went to that site, they probably didn't even see it, they didn't even hear it. Shout out to Erez Levin. I know this has been his crusade for a while. But it makes the numbers look better and the media buyers are none the wiser.
Sarah.
I mean, I'm gonna just go philosophical because I feel like David threw a
Love
lot
it.
around
Yeah.
again. We've made such complexity out of everything that we've touched, starting with display ads, and now this is like PTSD 2.0 with CTV. Like,
Yeah.
normally you'd go through an agency or through a regional buyer to buy your linear. You'd say what demographic generally you're after, and then you'd pay a certain amount. You reconcile that on the back end, bada bing, bada boom, we're good. And now they have made it so complex, this industry, in terms of what am I buying? Where am I buying? Where is it showing up? What's getting fraudulent clicks? What are the type of media? And ultimately, it is so hard to track as a brand. This is where I don't think agencies will die or go away. Like, having that advisor is very smart to keep up with this. And to David's points, like where to turn and where to look. But I'm a bigger fan of being closer to the inventory, aligning it to, the target demographic, looking at your reach that you need to make sure that's really nice and clean, and trying to use some of that logic and intuition we talked about before on where should I show up contextually relative to this audience, and use the
Yep.
data where you can, overlay testing, and go direct to the source as close as possible, and then use bidding environments or auction environments as like remnant or an augment and a secondary strategy, not your leading strategy. And even
Yep.
then try to ask the right questions of where is this, buy going. But I love contextual, and it's for the same reason you buy news on the morning and linear. So why are we thinking about it differently in programmatic? It should be about your audience, who you're trying to reach, and then tying logic, like I said, back to shows, programming. I could go on this
Yeah, well,
topic.
and aligning your advertising to the medium that it's being served in, right? And your top of funnel brand awareness plays should be going to mediums that are reach mediums where there's a ton of engagement, Super Bowl ads, things like that. Big screen television. Whereas there are things that are more appropriate for direct response, deeper funnel engagement, like your email channels and your direct mail channels, etc. So to me, part of it's a where are you reaching your audience, and then appropriately advertise to them in a relevant way within that environment, right? Like that's why I sort of think a QR code on CTV that's a television screen CTV buy seems to me a kind of a it may work, and maybe you guys can prove me wrong, but it seems like it's a misapplication of the
I can
media.
prove
Well, I
you
think
wrong.
it's nice.
I've never
I
seen
think
it
it's nice
work.
having the option. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, you've never
Not-
seen it work?
I've never seen it work. Maybe it's nice to have the option, but to me, it's like, okay, you're buying CTV because you want to be on the full screen, you want to get the most attention possible, right? So why are you making your video asset, which is the most powerful form of advertising, in my opinion, smaller, harder to look at, and then also drawing attention away from that asset to a QR code, to some words on in the overlay, and then you're also asking the person to start fumbling for his phone, trying to scan. Now he's not hearing the message. So to me, I think it's again us trying to force a channel to be something that it's not.
Oh,
And,
totally.
Well, what do you
and
think about like Amazon? Amazon has some really like they have those little buttons now. Like let's say it's an ad for
those
diapers.
see
You can
those are better.
Yeah.
Those are
because
more
it's
integrated.
Click to
right
send.
because and plus Amazon knows who you are, right? They know who you
Right.
are, because it's within their own. This is content owned and operated content, right? That they're able to
And
serve up
Amazon also
within their
doesn't
platform.
charge you more for those types of units. They're the same price as any other unit, which also I like. Um, v- Most publishers for like those QR code units, they're asking for pretty high minimums, and the CPMs are higher. So again, that goes back to my earlier point. You're creating this perception that humans operate in this psychological way where they're gonna scan the QR code, and the advertiser should pay more for that, and that's just creating bad expectations that often don't come to fruition.
So the title of your article was, cost of keeping quiet, and you had some great examples in there of, I mean, we talked about the perverse incentives, right, to continue spending more, not calling out maybe some of the shady behavior. I'd love to hear from the two of you for the sake of the viewers here. Maybe we can talk about like when you did try to bring up some things you found that didn't look right, when you tried to do like David as a media buyer, or Sarah both as an in-house planner buyer as well as agency. So I'd love to hear maybe from each one of you that an example of like, is there a cost for keeping quiet? Like what happens when people try to speak out? Maybe Sarah, start with you.
Yeah, I mean the examples I have are there. We, at Allstate when I took over the program, didn't own the ad account that's in the article of the social media ad account, which is important.
So it's run by the agency, right?
It's run by the agency. Yeah, and they recently had gotten acquired at that literal same time that I told them we would in-house this social media program by a top consulting firm under their digital arm. And we were definitely a big piece of business. And they refused to hand over that ad account to me.
Why would they not do that?
yeah.
Why would they not want to hand it over?
Yeah, aren't they contractually obligated to
No.
like there's terms and conditions and limits with your MSA with these agencies, right? In terms of
technically, no. If your MSA doesn't give you explicit ownership, or they're not working out of your ad account, so that's one of the pieces.
If you have a poorly written MSA, yeah,
I mean, blame the lawyers for this one. They should have had protections. But tell
this
us.
is going back to procurement, not understanding the nuances of why you should work out of one account versus another, because it all looked like Meta. Facebook was the name at the time. So it wasn't the consulting firm that did this. It was the contact who lost the business that I was working with who refused. And finally, I just said, screw it. Somebody's working with this company because it's a very large firm and another means. And I went through procurement and said, who else owns this contract on the consulting side? And inevitably, the first email, shocker, that I sent to say we're holding up work over there until I get my ad account, they released it. So it took me a couple of weeks and back and forth and some contentious conversations, but ultimately I was like, I'm not getting anywhere. And only reason I was able to talk them into it and to release those keys over to us was because we were a big company. So if you're a mid-sized company and you don't have that leverage,
you have no leverage at all,
then you're going to have to get super creative, and you might end up paying literal dollars in order to get that power back.
I mean, that is just that's a bad act, right, or a bad actor. But what data, what assets did they actually have that they were holding hostage in a sense?
Yeah, so if you think about any time you start a new campaign, you've got all the flighting, I had multi-millions running in this one platform with all the campaigns which we're relying on,
All the creatives there.
Yeah, you've got a 1.5 to 3 week ramp up time. You've got all the historical data, the connections into, the buying signals in order to have this perform. So plan B would be creating your own account from scratch, and you're going to create a disruption in the business because of the time that it's going to take to create a new account, but also that onboarding time in order to get that campaign off and running and producing the way that you expect, so that there isn't that disruption. I mean, we buy media because hopefully it performs, and you don't want a 4-week break in that process. So it was not a great problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually was asked by a client to do a media audit. Another agency was buying media for them, and like they refused to give over access to the DSP, and and their excuse was, well, there's multiple clients in there, which is fine, right? I mean, you can't prove or disprove that, but they couldn't give us access to other clients' data, and then they refused to give us the markups. It took months of fighting and legal letters from the client eventually to get that what was legally theirs, right? So I think that's interesting. Not super surprising to hear, and that's must have been frustrating. David, love to hear from you. I mean, like you had a good example in the article about I think raising your hand and saying like maybe you shouldn't be buying this inventory, right?
Yeah, so I'll actually give two examples. One was a very early on in my career formative experience. So I started out at a good publisher, Gameloft. They create great mobile games. I was part of the team that rolled out their initial programmatic offering. So that was a really good learning experience about how publishers operate and how they build out their programmatic stacks and all that. And I learned what I needed to learn there. And then I went to a vendor, right? And this vendor operated on an arbitrage model. That's how we would sell the media at a X CPM, and then the goal was to maximize margin and buy it at a lowest possible of a CPM as possible, while hitting the advertiser's goals at the same time. So I was trying to find that perfect mix of hitting the goals while maximizing the margin. Uh, Very early on, I noticed that the sites we were running on, by and large, and where the majority of spend was going to, were sites that I'd never heard of. That if you went to these sites, they were your classic templated, um, not legit content type sites. You could call it MFA or whatever you want. This was back in the mid 2010s, so MFA still was a name people were throwing around yet. Um, so like I noticed that I'm like, I don't think anyone would want to be on these sites, but at the same time,
So is this principle based media? Was it like were they're buying and then selling, keeping
yeah, but
the
it's
spread?
not like we weren't getting the inventory up front. We were just basically buying through a DSP through
Just
multiple
arbitrage. Okay.
SSPs.
Yep.
So it was just classic arbitrage, right? But my bonuses were based on how high my margins are, right? So I was driving the highest margin business and getting the highest bonuses out of all the traders, and I felt really dirty and bad about it.
Yeah, you were
Right?
buying like the cheapest inventory possible,
Right.
selling it at the highest price possible, and then you, lo and behold, realized the cheapest inventory, was being produced, but in sweatshops overseas with WordPress sites that keep generating more and more versions to show
Exactly.
fake real ads to fake people in a way.
Exactly. So,
Right.
like on average, I was getting 80 to 90% margins, and the advertiser was the brand was none the wiser because, of course, we weren't transparent, so we couldn't share the site lists even when asked. The blanket excuse was that our publisher relationships forbid us from sharing those site lists, even though we didn't have any direct publisher relationships. We were just buying SSP volume. But we could provide a top 10 list, right? And I always wondered why the publishers in that top 10 list were okay to share, even though that top 10 list was completely fabricated and just had sites that, would look good to the layperson. So needless to say, like I didn't feel good doing that. So I didn't stay too long at that company, but that was one of my, and also I also realized just how easy it is to hit these vanity metrics that advertisers want, um, even if you're running on just BS inventory at the same time, right? So that was my early toe in the water in the incentives and just the way things work game. I went to another media vendor after that. That one was actually worse in many ways, and we could get into that on another podcast, perhaps, where we share just more war stories. But after that, I went to the holding company side, right? And when I went to the holding company side, that was my attempt at trying to make a difference and trying to, use the knowledge that I had accrued doing things that I wasn't proud of to protect brands and do right by them.
Yeah.
And I was still naive, and I thought, the agencies, they just didn't, they want to do right, and they just didn't know, they just don't know better for whatever reason. And they just need more knowledgeable people coming from the other side, because typically people go from the agency side to the vendor side. I don't think it's as common for people from the vendor side to go to the agency side. Right. So I was a bit naive, and I thought that, I could make a difference and help educate brands and drive value for them there. But lo and behold, even at the holding company, I saw that our trading desk was still buying all the same crap that I was buying on my past roles. And I tried to do something about it. I tried to speak up. I actually pitched the client on what at that time I called a curated marketplace strategy. And this was before curation was even a thing. But my whole idea was, why do we need to go to these middlemen? Why do we need to buy tens and tens of thousands of sites? Why can't we're a holding company. We have the direct publisher relationships. Why don't we just onboard a bunch of
Just create an allow list, right, of like premium publishers, right?
Yeah.
well, not even an allow list. I was like, let's just get PMPs going, right? Let's just
Yeah.
build up a marketplace of PMPs, layer on audiences on these bundled PMP marketplaces, and then we could still scale.
Premium. Yeah.
It's going to be a bit of a higher CPM at the same time, but like we'll still be able to scale all our audience targeting. We could bring in more publishers, but we'll have more control over the inventory set. We'll know exactly where the money's going. We'll know what we're buying. And I thought that was a great idea, and the client thought it was an amazing idea.
Well, the client liked it.
Client liked it. Client
Okay,
loved
good.
it. They're like, this makes a lot of sense. But my leadership didn't like it. They didn't like it at all.
Yeah.
Were the margins low? Margins were lower on the other inventory. Is that it?
It was a combination of margin, non-transparent margins, kickbacks via the different suppliers, and all those things that go into.
So it economically didn't make as much sense to the agency, to be fully transparent. And the brand, just so we know from a brand perspective, was this a kind of a big premium brand that should
Oh yeah, this was
advertise?
Microsoft.
Yeah,
No,
this is Microsoft. So they should be. Yeah, this is not like a Temu, cheap product direct from the warehouse type of situation. This was a real brand that wants to get in front of real buyers, right? And talk about engineering relevance into the advertising sort of the bid stream or the advertising ecosystem. It doesn't seem to me that you're achieving the goals of Microsoft by advertising against shitty content. That is largely the audiences that go to these places are probably largely irrelevant to Microsoft's interests.
Well, Brett, you think about it. The brand supported David's strategy. David, as the planner and buyer, is recommending the strategy, right? I mean, and then, it makes sense. Like the brand, you think they'd be supportive, right? And they were, which is great. But then the agency didn't like it. It sounds like
it. Didn't like it. No. And, this was actually right after I got promoted to a bit of a higher level role where I could, set strategy and call some level of shots. But the end result was I was put on a PIP and basically told, we like what you do, we like you, we want you to stay here, but if you keep rocking the boat, we're gonna have to
quit being so honest, quit listening to your clients. Quit doing what's right for them.
Right.
That's
so
crazy.
It was like, yeah. So it was like, shut up and we'll all be good, or you keep talking and there's gonna be problems. And my ultimate decision was I quit. And then I went to do my own consultancy for 4 years, where I got to, actually work directly with brands and agencies that wanted to do right by their clients and help them out in the ways I thought best, and drive value. So like on one hand, there was experience where, keeping quiet actually made me more money, right? Not doing necessarily right, drove my bonuses. And then there was another, just like, I think, a lot of people on the holding company side deal with this type of situation where they just, come in, they do their job. They know they can't rock the boat because they'll jeopardize things. And, they come in for a paycheck and then leave. But for me, at least, I couldn't do that.
I mean, do you think it's changing? And Sarah, I'm going to throw this at you. I mean, with the spotlight being shown on these dark corners, these dark recesses of misaligned,
the dark underbelly. I love that.
The dark underbelly of the ad ecosystem. I mean, do you think that things will change, and how do you better align incentives? Because you could argue that there's certain incentives that could be driven by the brand. In this particular example, it was not the case. The brands seemed to want to do the right thing. The agency wanted to maximize margin, right? And so that became your kind of breaking point. What do you think? What do you think needs to happen for things to improve? Do you think it will change?
Um, I'm reluctant that it's going to change. I see different companies. I call it the shell game. Whenever a word gets out about one thing and where the bodies are buried in the dark underbelly, which is the brands start understanding what questions to ask. So now, we're open path for Trade Desk is a good example of that for me. I love going direct to publishers. I like having a closer throughput. But in the case of OpenPath, they're changing the algorithm to weight inventory and push the inventory delivery into OpenPath, which they're making a higher margin on. And the problem with that is not that it's competing with SSPs on the CPM, which is every argument I keep getting. It's that they've created a new supply path and they've forgotten that everything starts at the top of the waterfall. And now they're competing against a PG deal. That's the apples to apples comparison, where brands already are buying that up front. And now they have to unravel and detangle an inventory mess that Trade Desk has not been proactive in communicating, that are making higher margin on that. Q4 earnings are coming out soon, so I'll be curious to see when they're dipping in there what that will look like. But ultimately, that's one example of Trade Desk burying bodies on their fees, their platform fee, which is compounding fees. They mark up on their inventory. They're marking up on data, marking up on everything, and it doesn't show up on an invoice. So
Yeah,
ultimately,
and they're eating into the direct buy plays by the publishers,
correct.
right?
That's correct. And so the end point here is they've now gone in and created a new mode to get rid of all the fee stacking, quote unquote, and that's called the advanced mode now. They did not. This is when they labeled all SSPs as resellers in the platform. So in September, they actually started making these changes. They did not.
Did they label every SSP a reseller?
And that's deprioritized in the algo, but also they have something called the
Interesting.
TVQI, which is the TV quality index. I bet you it's deprioritized on the score as well. So you're seeing this inverse effect with delivery now over-indexing and competing with large brands that have direct buy. So my argument here is not that it's wrong. I don't dislike the strategy and going close to make sure that we have great inventory, regardless of where it's coming from. It's the execution. They're charging publishers 5% as a fee. Their undisclosed markup on top of that. And now what they've done, this is my articulation of an example, is they've changed fees in one area and pulled it into a different area, and buyers are not really aware of this change.
Yeah,
So
a
I'm
lack
not
of transparency around that. It's a little bit of a gaming the system in a way,
And
right?
I have to give him credit because, there's been this whole narrative over the past year or so of direct versus resellers, and resellers are bad. And that
Yeah.
narrative was largely seeded and started by the Trade Desk, right? And they started pushing, they started putting these putting together these S chain reports for clients, showing them how much resold inventory they're buying and how they need to optimize into direct, and to turn off resellers. And it was a long game because then they rolled out, of course, they already had OpenPath, but then they started rolling out OpenPath more and more in their positioning, in their market positioning, and pushing it harder to clients. And then they had the SP 500, and then they forced Kokai on everybody, where now OpenPath and SP 500 are on by default when someone creates a new line item in Kokai. So I do have to give them some level of credit. It was some good social engineering there. Not that I disagree.
Push from a positioning perspective to direct, and then actually eat into the direct margin.
Right.
That's
Because
right.
become a direct supplier in a sense.
Yeah, which competes with the agencies they work with. So think about holdcos. Part of the value proposition there is they're buying massive amounts of inventory. I'm going to flip what David said on its head earlier, and you get economies of scale for brands.
Yeah.
Well, this is
Principle-based buying.
essentially
Yep.
what the trade desk is now doing. So how does that work with the holdco model, TBD, on what that will do to cannibalize that?
Yeah,
You
plus, they're
also,
going direct with many big brands. I had a big pharma client. Trade Desk was there going direct, and they're still working through agencies. But how much longer do they? If they don't have to, they won't, right? I mean, it's clearly like they're. I mean,
yeah.
that's the direction they're going in. I would argue.
Yeah. So that's the optimism. That's one example. It's very recent. It's taking something and turning it into a different problem. So I think ultimately, what should people do? I would like brands to hold themselves accountable, to ask the right questions, hold companies to margin instead of CPMs.
Yep.
Like to make sure that they ask questions on going beyond the invoice, not just what's buried in the CPM. Tell me every dollar, quarter by quarter, how much you took of my media dollars, so you get to the true working to non-working.
Would
If
it
you're
even be possible to get an answer though? I mean, like it's so opaque, right?
and not if you don't push them in the programmatic realm. Absolutely. I've run those audits and I've terminated contracts as a result of the findings, because you can't lie on the data. This is where I do like quantification.
But you would need to see the markups, right? You would need to have access to in-platform to see them, right?
Well, it was a manual pull on the behalf of this one DSP that I'm thinking of, and it was over 55% fees. So it was $1 million that they were taking in profit on this one campaign a month.
Well,
And
I
Wow.
ran one audit, Sarah, and I found some markups up to 400% for no reason.
yeah,
It's crazy. I mean, I think that's a little extreme, but 15% is what they're supposed, let's say contractually supposed to be taking. If you're seeing markups for, if extra work is going in and it's justified, maybe, but a lot of the markups I remember finding were not. So keep going. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
no, that's okay, but it's egregious, and I think that they're less outliers than they are the norm if you don't know what you're asking. So go beyond the CPM and go
Yep.
into margins and pull manual pulls. The third thing is, coming from the buy side, I had really great partners that were very honest, and their sales structures are meant to promote their own products. Can we actually turn that on its head? I don't really know that we'll combat that fully, but I always align myself with those that made recommendations or suggestions and went outside of their role and outside of their company, because those are the good actors you kind of want to shadow and, ask for those POVs. So do you think they exist? I think they should be speaking up more, and ultimately, that's kind of some of the advice I'd give, but there's a lot more where that came from. This is where I think training comes in.
Yeah, and do you think, and speaking of training, do you think that there needs to be, is there a reskilling here? I mean, let's say we're just focused on the marketing department for a second, we could go to other departments, but do we have the right people in place that know the questions to ask, that are technical enough to understand the nuances of the ecosystem for digital in general, not just programmatic or CTV and otherwise? And do we have to reskill in that department or in that area, or do we think that they can, that people have the knowledge, they're just not asking the right questions? I mean, what do you think?
I think that legacy CMOs are largely grown up in brand and product positioning, like
Yeah.
where I started. What you're seeing is the convergence of AI and tech and machine learning and all sorts of different complexities that is starting to flip that, but it's a slow flip. You're getting people like me that are starting to get ingrained and T-shaped more in that analytics realm. And my feeling is that there's still a lot of brand and legacy brand. I'm not saying that's bad, but what you need to make sure you're hiring right on your team for those gaps and be aware of those gaps. But this is where I personally love that I'm leaned into analytics and tech, but also have the business strategy side. So the consultancies and advisories like mine will pay off dividends if you just do sounding board gut checks and also don't rely on your own team, because then you're just talking to yourself within your walls. So there's definitely, I think, in the future going to be this turnover of talent and where they grew up, but right now it's still heavily in the brand realm from what I see.
Yep.
How about you, David? I know we're getting a little short on time. What are your, if you were going to give some advice to, let's say, people on the brand side, what coders should they be doing in order to get ahead of this, to create a better environment, or is it not their responsibility? Is the agencies? Love to hear your advice.
No, I think they need to take more ownership over their house, right? So one, you could bring in Sarah. I think that's always going to be a good decision.
Always a good idea.
Thank you, David.
But two, I mean, you do need to bring some technical level of expertise in-house in some way. I know,
Yep.
I know there's companies that have completely in-house programmatic operations. For some, they can do that, others can't. But you should not be fully trusting and dependent on your media partners and agencies and just let them do their thing. And unquestionably, right? I've seen that not work out way too many times. Middle of last year, I remember auditing a CTV campaign for a law firm, and they spend a lot. This law firm spends about 50 million on TV all in. But their CTV vendor, and they didn't have an agency, they had a vendor, managed service vendor, sold them on the Super Bowl. They sold them CTV impressions on the Super Bowl when those were not able to be bought programmatically, right?
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
$120.
This was not a
Yep.
Peacock ad, is what you're saying.
No.
How could
it
you
was
even?
not.
You couldn't even buy it, right? It's just it's not even available.
You can't even buy it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless it's video on demand later, not live.
I don't. Yeah. No, not
That's
during
the
the
only
live
argument I
broadcast.
could make.
Yeah.
So like all this brand got was just a spreadsheet that said Super Bowl placement, X CPM, X impressions, and that's it.
And it doesn't take rocket science to figure that out, to ask the right questions. You don't have to be radically technical or analytical or a data scientist to figure that out, right?
Well, you should have some curiosity. You should do your homework on it. But a lot of people just don't have the time, or they just think, why would my vendor rip me off like this?
Right.
They don't realize that ultimately this is unfortunately an ocean of sharks that we're all swimming in.
So have someone check your agency's homework. It sounds like that's probably a good idea, whether it's someone in-house or maybe a third party, like bringing a Sarah right to do that. I mean, it sounds like that's probably a smart thing to do periodically, safe to say.
I'd say so. I know there's third party auditing companies as well, like in Ubiquity. I hear good things about them. I just highly caution not to fully trust any one party with your media spend, because there's just too many bad incentives around that might make things go awry.
And how about untangling all of the markups and take rates and different fees within, let's say, within ad tech, right? I mean, I've worked a lot with the publisher side, and you see just, you're getting pennies and dollars sometimes, right? And I'm working with one cable company now. They're talking about, like traditional dollars versus digital pennies, right? Because it's such a different environment. How can they start to untangle that as well? I mean, love your thoughts on it.
I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, you need to have that ad tech expertise in house, right? And you need to have really strong contracts. I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, it really just starts with your contracts with your partners. If you're not contractually protected, then there's really nothing you could do to untangle those fees. And this goes for publishers. This goes for brands, right? You need to have full audit rights. You need to make sure that you're able to check every single dollar and where it went. And also have a full understanding of who these vendors or tech companies, where they're sending your money to, right? And how the dollar breaks down. But I believe that the best thing they could do is start with having airtight contracts, because then at the very end, at the very least, they're not going to bring in a Sarah to come in and set things right. Lawyers are very, very scary.
So contracts. It's interesting you say that, because I remember I was brought in by Health System to audit some of their work, and we found it was around 22% ad fraud, right? Which was, it didn't seem like it was intentional. It seemed it was more just sloppy. Like there was a couple affiliates that started. I mean, a lot of the traffic was actually going overseas, right? And then it started performing well, lo and behold, and so they optimized and actually sent more traffic there. And then we couldn't even get a make good, because contractually, to your point, they didn't owe them anything, right? So we had them rewrite the contracts when they ended up renewing with the same agency, but they ended up saying, okay, if this happens in the future, you at least owe us a make good, right? We have audit rights. If we find egregious fraud, you do owe us at least a make good for that budget amount. So I think that's a good point about contracts. Well, I see we're getting short on time here. And I know, David, you have a hard stop. So maybe before we go, maybe if you could tell our viewers how Sarah, let's maybe start with you. If viewers want to get a hold of you, if they have any questions about the work you do, if they want to contact you, if they want to bring in an expert, let's say, to take a look at these things, how would they get a hold of you?
Yeah, thank you guys also for your hospitality on this amazing show here. I am on LinkedIn primarily, Sarah Caputo, and I do follow quite a few people. So if you want to look under the nooks and crannies, if you're starting out, I think that's a good place to start. And in terms of who and what companies I follow, I also can be procured through U of Digital. I ran about 50 workshops for them last year from March to December.
They do great work.
Yeah, so I think I was almost 50 I ran last year, my first year working with them. So
and Shiv was on this pod. He was one of our early guests. Yeah.
Yeah, I love Shiv. So I can also be found there.
Nice. David, how about you? If anyone, I mean, I know you post a lot in social and you're very active. And if someone's get hold of you, like where's the best way to find you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm terminally on LinkedIn, unfortunately. But that's probably the best place you can reach me, and I'm always happy to respond, share notes. Happy to always look at data, campaigns, and just let you know my feedback. So LinkedIn's probably the easiest place to reach me, and I'll never leave you hanging.
Or I could pop up a QR code because David.
This may not be the right medium, the medium of choice for QR codes. But yeah, for those watching on YouTube, we're going to show a QR code in a minute. No, but
it'll bounce around the screen, right? Just like that.
Yeah, exactly. Pick up your phone and scan.
I missed my neon light in the back.
Yeah. So this was a great episode. We're definitely going to have you two back. Thank you so much. And Sarah and David are going to be contributing to Signal.
Yeah, Brett, maybe we can do an episode on like the real dark underbelly, and we can all pick our shadiest stories, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You can bring in Foo for that one. We can bring in
Foo.
That'd
be a fun one.
Yeah, and so wherever you're listening, subscribe, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We've got lots of episodes coming down the pipe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
And check out The Cost of Keeping Silent by Sarah and I.
Thank
on
you.
signalanoise.ai.
See you guys.
Bye, everyone.